An abandoned girl was tied to a scarecrow in a cornfield. A farmer cut her loose with shears. The shears were in my right hand because I'd meant to go out that morning and cut the damaged stalks along the east fence, the ones the hail had broken over in July, and that were leaning now, half-rotten, into the good corn. I had put it off 2 weeks. That particular putting off was the kind I did when there was no good reason to hurry and no one to answer to, when a morning could go slow if it wanted to, and the field would still be there when I got to it. I was 40 yards into the row when I saw what I thought was the scarecrow in the wrong place. I stopped, wiped my face with the back of my wrist, looked again. The scarecrow I'd made 15 years prior from an old coat and a broomstick had collapsed in a windstorm 3 springs back. I hadn't replaced it. There were no crows worth worrying about that year, and after my wife passed, I'd gotten particular about what I bothered with and what I let go, and a scarecrow felt like the kind of thing that belonged to a different version of this farm. So there was no scarecrow in my east field. There hadn't been one in 3 years. What I was looking at was a person. I moved closer, not running, because my knee didn't allow running anymore, and also because something in me was already trying to figure out what I was seeing before I arrived at it. She was bound at the wrists and the ankles. Arms stretched out along the crossbar of a post I didn't own, a post someone had driven into my ground without my knowing, and she was hanging off it the way a coat hangs on a peg, all her weight sagging forward, her chin to her chest, her dark hair fallen over her face. She was alive. I could see the slow rise of her back. I don't know what a man is supposed to feel when he comes across something like that. I know what I felt. I felt my jaw go hard and a cold settle in behind my eyes, the particular cold that is not panic and is not sorrow. It is the thing a man feels when the world has done something that requires him to act. I cut the rope at her wrists first. My hands are not small and the shears are not delicate, and I had to work around her without jostling the post too much. Her hands were white. The rope had been on long enough to mark her, red channels across both wrists swollen. When her arms came free, they dropped like they were filled with sand, and I caught her under the arms, took her weight against my chest. She made a sound, not a word, something that was half breath, half moan, the kind of sound a person makes when the body is so far down it can't organize language yet. I cut the rope at her ankles, she buckled, I held her. She was not heavy. She had the weight of someone who hadn't eaten in a couple of days, which I would later find out was exactly right. I carried her out of the corn. My name is Harlan Cade. I have farmed this land in eastern Colorado for going on 37 years, first with my father, then alone, then with my wife Clara for 19 of those years, and then alone again after Clara died of the thing in her lung that the doctor found too late. That was 4 years ago. I was 61. The farm was 312 acres of corn and winter wheat, a woodlot, a creek bed that ran good water March through June and then went to a trickle, and a house that was too large for one person but that I had no particular interest in making smaller. I tell you this not because I think you need the whole history of the place, but because a man's land is his context. If you want to know why I am the way I am, why I did what I did, the land is most of the answer. My nearest neighbor to the north was 8 miles. To the south, 6. The road that passed my gate was county gravel, and in an ordinary week I might see 4 trucks use it. I was not a man who needed a lot of company, and the land did not encourage it. I had not had a woman in my house since Clara. Not in that way, not in any way. My sister had come up from Pueblo twice in 4 years and stayed a few days each time, and that was the sum of it. The house was orderly. I kept it that way. I did not keep it out of hope. I kept it out of habit, and because Clara had been particular about order, and some habits outlast the people who taught them to you. I laid the girl on the couch in the front room and went to the kitchen for water, and for the kit I kept in the cabinet under the sink, the one with the gauze and the iodine and the tape. I brought both back and sat on the edge of the coffee table and looked at her in the light from the window. She was young, 20-something, maybe. Dark hair and dark eyes that were now half open and watching me with the particular look of someone who is trying to decide whether the danger has changed or only changed location. Her face had a cut above the left eye that had dried and crusted. Her lip was split. One of her cheekbones was swollen in a way that made me think someone had hit her there with something harder than a fist. I set the water glass on the table within her reach and said, "You're safe." She didn't say anything. She looked at me. "My name is Harlan Cade. This is my farm. You were in my cornfield. I don't know who put you there or why." She looked at the glass of water. I picked it up and held it out. She took it with both hands, the wrist still marked, and drank half of it in one pull, then stopped and breathed. "There's more," I said. She finished it. I refilled it twice before she slowed down. The doctoring I could do was limited. I cleaned the cut above her eye, which was not deep enough to need stitching but which had dried into a ragged line that needed the dirt out of it. She held still through that. She had a kind of stillness that was not passivity. It was more like a person who has learned to conserve everything, including the energy that complaint would cost. I put 2 fingers lightly on the swollen cheekbone and she didn't flinch, just looked at me with those dark eyes. I said I didn't think it was broken, but I wasn't a doctor. She nodded. I brought her a bowl of broth that I had on the stove. I'd been making a pot of something most Sundays and letting it go through the week, and set it on the table and got up to give her room. She pulled herself upright slowly, like each part of her body was reporting in separately, and ate the broth with the spoon I brought, and then the rest of the bread that was on the board. She didn't talk and I didn't push. I pulled the armchair from the corner to the window and sat there with the almanac and gave her the room to just be. The first thing I learned about her was her name, which was Nora Blaine. She told me that the second day, when she was sitting up and had eaten some broth and some of the bread I'd baked the Tuesday before. She told me her name like she was testing whether I would recognize it, and when I didn't show any recognition she seemed to relax some. The second thing I learned was that she was from Wichita originally, and that she had been traveling alone. She did not say where she had been going. She did not say who had bound her to the post in my field or why. I did not press. I had been around enough human trouble to know that you don't pry the story out of a person. You make them warm and fed and let the story come when it's ready. Clara had taught me that. She'd been good at it, better than me. What I did those first 2 days was what I always did. I got up before 5, made coffee, went out to the fields. The August heat that year was the grinding kind, the kind that came before dawn and didn't let up until well after dark, and the mornings were the only relief you got. I worked through the morning, came in around noon, made something to eat, checked on her, went back out. In the evenings I sat on the porch and watched the light go off the wheat. She slept most of the first 2 days deeply, the way the body sleeps when it has used everything up and is rebuilding from scratch. I checked on her every hour or so without going in, just stood in the doorway and listened to her breathing, which was what you do. On the afternoon of the second day she was sitting up when I looked in, looking out the window, and she turned and looked at me without alarm. That was an improvement. On the morning of the third day, she came out to the porch. She was wearing a shirt that had been my wife's, the dark blue cotton one Clara had worn to garden in, and a pair of my work pants that I'd found the smallest belt I owned to keep up. Her feet were bare. The cut above her eye had scabbed over. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, not from cold. It was already warm, but from the habit of someone who wasn't sure how much space she had the right to take up. "You don't have to stand in the door," I said. She came out and sat in the other chair, the one Clara had always taken. We sat there for a while without saying anything. The light was coming up orange over the east field, over the exact place where I'd found her, and I watched her watch it. Her jaw was working the way a person's jaw works when they're deciding something. "There were 3 of them," she said finally. I looked at the light. "They took my money, they took the wagon and the horse." She paused. "I fought. I shouldn't have, or I should have fought harder, I'm not sure which." Another pause. They tied me to that post and they left. How long were you out there? I don't know, a night, maybe more. I lost time. I nodded. The creek was up that week. I could hear it from the porch, the quiet run of it through the low ground near the woodlot. A red-tailed hawk was working the east field, circling, unhurried. Do you know which way they went? I asked. West on the road. I nodded again. I was already thinking about it, what I would do with that information and what I wouldn't, what a man could accomplish 3 days behind and what he couldn't. I put it aside for later. Where were you headed? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The hawk dropped, then pulled up with nothing, resumed the circle. Grand Junction, she said. I have an aunt there, or I had one. I haven't heard from her in 2 years. I don't know if she's still in the same place. That's a long way. Yes. Alone. She looked at me then. Her eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them that was not asking for my opinion. Yes, she said, alone. I let it go. It was not my business how she'd come to be traveling alone or why or what she was leaving, and I wasn't a man who thought a woman owed me her reasons. She healed faster than I expected. By the end of the first week she was helping with the meals, which I would not have asked for, and which she did without asking whether she could. She cooked the way a person cooks when cooking has been part of surviving, not part of pleasure, efficient, almost impatient, making the most of what was in the larder without wasting emotion. She was good at it, better than me. Clara had been the cook in this house, and when Clara died I'd gotten functional, beans and bread and whatever I'd shot or whatever the neighbor's wife sent over at Christmas. Nora moved through the kitchen with a decisiveness that was different from Clara's, and that surprised me. She was half Clara's age and had none of Clara's ease, but she had her own kind of certainty about what belonged where and what didn't, and she made use of things in the back of the cabinet that I hadn't touched in years. I ate better that week than I had in 4 years. I did not tell her this. It seemed like too large a thing to say. By the second week she was well enough to be useful in the field, which she asked to do, and which I tried to talk her out of. The heat was serious. Her hands weren't fully healed at the wrists. She looked at me with the same expression she'd used on the porch, and I handed her a pair of work gloves and took her to the section of fence along the north boundary that needed the most attention. She worked without complaint. She worked actually with a kind of concentration that was more than endurance. She wasn't just tolerating the work. She was paying attention to it, learning the rhythms of it. She asked questions that were the right questions, the ones a person asks when they want to understand the thing itself and not just get through it. I answered them. I found myself explaining things I hadn't explained to anyone in years, why I planted the north section a week later than the south, how I could tell by the color of a stalk whether the root system was good or whether there was something wrong in the ground, the creek's behavior in spring and what it meant for the summer growth, the particular way this land drained, the low spots, the places where you had to be careful. The fact that the southwest corner had always run 2 degrees colder than the rest of the field because of how the hill to the west cut the afternoon sun, a thing my father had noticed and told me, and that I had verified myself over 30 years. She listened the way good listeners do, not nodding along, but actually quiet, taking it in. On the 4th day of working the fence, she said, without looking up from the wire she was pulling taut, "You talk about this land like it's a person." I thought about it. "I suppose I do," I said. "Clara left you this." I looked at her. "I found the marker in the yard," she said. "Under the cottonwood. I wasn't prying. I just saw it. She's buried there, yes." "How long?" 4 years in October. She pulled the wire to the next post and hooked it without saying anything, and I was glad she didn't say she was sorry. I'd had 4 years of people telling me they were sorry. The word had gone flat from overuse. What she did instead after a minute was say, "It's a good marker, she would have liked it." I didn't know how she could know that. I almost said so. But there was something in the way she'd said it, matter of fact, not sentimental, that made it sit right. I let it sit. The third week she stayed, I rode into Cooperaton, which was the nearest town with a post office and a store, and I asked at the store about 3 men traveling west with a horse and wagon matching the description Nora had given me. The man behind the counter, Pete Gillum, who'd been running that store for 30 years and knew everything that moved along those roads, looked at me without expression and said that 3 men of that description had come through about 10 days prior, had bought supplies and stayed one night at the boarding house, and had moved on west the next morning. "Any trouble?" I asked. "Not while they were here," he said, in the way that suggested he knew there'd been trouble elsewhere. I bought what I needed and drove home. I didn't tell Nora about the Cooperaton stop. There was nothing to tell that would help her and a good deal that might frighten her, and fear wasn't what she needed. What she needed was time, which was what the farm was giving her. What the farm was giving me was something I hadn't expected. I want to be honest about this because I think the only reason to tell a story is to tell it true. I was not a man who had been looking for company. I had gotten used to the way a life goes when it's only yours, the particular silences, the timing of things, the way a day shapes itself when there's no one else's preferences or rhythms to account for. I had not minded it. I had, in fact, settled into it with something close to comfort, the way an old dog settles into the one spot on the floor where the morning light hits just right. Nora changed the shape of the days. Not violently, not with noise or disruption. She was not a chatty person. She was comfortable in silence the way people are when silence has been their company more than other people have been. But there was a presence to her. A weight in the good sense, the sense of something substantial occupying space, so that the house felt less like a container and more like a house. I noticed it most in the evenings. She would sit at the kitchen table after supper with a book. She'd found a small shelf of books in the back bedroom, ones Clara had collected, and she worked through them slowly, the way a person reads when they haven't had much access to books and are taking their time with them. I would sit across the room and go through the accounts or the almanac or the repair notes I kept on the equipment, the lamp between us, the creek outside. The August heat finally letting go by 9 or 10 o'clock, and the air coming down from the high ground to the north, cool and dry. We didn't always talk. When we did, it was about the farm or the books or something she'd noticed during the day. She had a sharp eye. She noticed things I'd stopped noticing years ago, the way the light shifted over the wheat in the afternoon, the pattern in how the crows moved before a weather change, the particular sound the windmill made when the bearing was getting dry. That last one I would not have caught until spring, when it would have been a real problem. She caught it in August. I greased the bearing the next morning and thought about what I would have done without that ear paying attention. She got better with her hands as the weeks went on. The rope marks faded to pale lines by the end of the first week, and she stopped favoring them by the end of the second. I noticed because I was watching without meaning to, not for the reason a man watches a young woman, but the way you watch a piece of equipment that's been damaged. You keep an eye on it. You make sure it's going to hold. There were other things she showed me, not all of them easy. She was not a trusting person. She was polite in a way that kept you at arm's length, and there were questions I learned not to ask, not because she told me to stop, but because the look she gave would close like a window shutting, and I'd lose 3 days of whatever progress we'd made. I learned which questions those were, and I learned not to ask them. A man who has been married 19 years has some experience in this. Clara had her own closed windows, different ones, and I'd learned those too. The difference with Nora was that when a window opened, it opened in a way that you'd almost miss. Not a grand gesture, not a revelation. She'd say something plain and small, and in it would be a piece of herself she hadn't given before, and then she'd go back to whatever she'd been doing, and you understood you were meant to receive it quietly. One of those came on a Wednesday in the third week. We were pulling the last of the mending wire around the north section, and the sun was about an hour from setting, still hot, but starting to let go at the edges. She stopped and straightened and looked out at the land to the north, the long flat emptiness of it, the sky just beginning to go orange at the horizon. "I grew up in a city," she said. "I didn't know land could feel like this." "Like what?" She was quiet for a few seconds. "Like it doesn't need you," she said, "but it doesn't mind that you're here." I thought about that a long time. She picked up the wire and went back to work, but I thought about it for a long time. On a Thursday night in the middle of the third week, she looked up from her book and said, "You're going to need to harvest the south section by the first week of September, or you'll lose some of it to the early freeze." I looked up. "The stalks in the southwest corner are already showing it," she said. "The color's off. I noticed it yesterday when we were doing the fence." I set down the almanac. "I know," I said. "I'm short a hand for that. I've been meaning to post at the cooperative feed store." "You have me," she said. I looked at her. "I've been watching what you do," she said. "I learn fast, I told you that." She had not told me that, but it was true, I'd seen it. "It's hard work," I said. "The corn comes off faster if you have the right people, and it still takes a couple of weeks on a section that size. The weather won't wait on." "I know," she said. "I said I'd help." There was no apology in the way she said it. No hedging. It was just a plain statement of intention, the kind a person makes when they've already decided and the only thing left is for the other person to catch up. I went back to the almanac. "All right," I said. The harvest started the second day of September. I had hired on 2 hands from Cooperative, brothers named Dell and Virgil Ash, who'd worked my south section 2 seasons running, and who knew the pace I kept. With Nora that made 4 of us, and I put her with Dell on the rows nearest the barn because Dell was the slower of the 2, and she could set a pace without being dragged into his, which was a calculation I made without explaining, and which, looking back, was the first time I'd made that kind of calculation about her. The way you start factoring a person into your planning without noticing you've started doing it. We worked from first light to the light failing. The early September days had a quality of urgency to them that I always found clarifying. The heat still there but shifting, a freshness coming in off the mountains in the late afternoon, the sense that the season was turning without waiting for permission, and that you had better keep up. Nora kept up. What I mean is, she did more than keep up. She had, in 3 weeks on this farm, learned the work to a degree that still puzzles me when I think about it, not just the motions, but the judgment. When to push and when to ease. When a stalk was clean and when there was something wrong at the root. The way the rows needed to be worked so you weren't backtracking, wasting steps, losing time to the heat. Dell noticed it. On the third day he said to me quietly, while she and Virgil were working the far end of a row, "Where'd she work before?" "She didn't," I said, "not farm work." He looked at me and then looked back at her. "She works like she did," he said. I said nothing to that, but I kept it with me. In the evening she was tired the same way I was tired, the good kind, the kind that goes deep into the muscles and doesn't leave room for much thinking, the kind you earn. We ate at the kitchen table, the 4 of us on harvest days, and then the brothers drove back to Cooperative and Nora, and I sat on the porch a while before she went in to sleep. Sometimes we didn't speak at all. She would sit in Clara's chair and I would sit in mine, and we'd listen to the creek and the nighthawks, and the particular nothing that a farm makes after the work is done. Some evenings she'd have a cup of something in her hands, and she'd watch the stars come out over the east field, over the exact strip of ground where I'd found her, and I never asked what she thought about when she looked at it. One night, about a week into the harvest, she said, "Dell asked me today if I was your wife." I looked at the dark line of the wheat. "I told him no," she said. "That's right," I said. A pause. "He seemed surprised," she said. I let that sit without answering. After a while she went inside. The story of how they came is a short story, and I'll tell it quickly because the before and after matter more than the moment itself, though the moment itself was not forgettable. It was 2 weeks into the harvest, on a Tuesday afternoon. I was on the north side of the barn and didn't hear the wagon come in because the wind was wrong. What I heard was Nora's voice, not loud, but the kind of not loud that carries because it's controlled. I came around the corner of the barn. 3 men on a wagon, 2 sitting, 1 standing in the bed. The one standing was big through the shoulders with a red beard, and he was looking at Nora the way a man looks at something he thinks he still has a claim to. The horse in the traces was a gray mare with a blaze. I knew the horse. I'd heard Nora describe it. She was standing at the well, very still, with a bucket handle in her right hand. I came out from behind the barn with the rifle. I always kept the rifle on the nail inside the barn door. I hadn't thought about it, hadn't planned it. It was just in my hands because that was where I went when I came around the corner. "Get off my land," I said. The big one looked at me. He was doing the arithmetic, 1 old man with a rifle versus 3 of them, and I could see him deciding which math he liked. "We're not looking for trouble," he said, "just looking for something that belongs to us." "Nothing on this land belongs to you," I said. "She does." I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The 2 sitting men were very still. The one on the left had his hand close to his belt, and I'd already noted that and was not worried about it. A man who is going to do something does not put his hand close and wait. He puts it close when he wants you to see it. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of looking at it. "No," I said, "she doesn't, not in any sense that will hold. Get off my land." He didn't move right away. He was still doing arithmetic. What he didn't know was what I know, which is that the arithmetic of a confrontation is not really about the numbers. It's about the look in a man's eyes when he's already decided that he will do what he's saying, and whether the other man can see that or not. I had made my decision when I came around the corner of the barn. There was no calculating left in me. He could see it. "She owes us," he said, but the conviction had gone out of the word. "Write it off," I said. "Get off my land." The sitting men were already looking at each other. The big one with the red beard held my eyes another 5 seconds. I counted them, which is something you do when you've been through a few moments like this. And then he sat back down on the wagon bed, and the other one turned the horse, and they went back down the drive to the county road and turned west without looking back. I stood there until the dust settled. Nora said nothing for a while. Then, "That's my horse." "Yes." "You knew that." "I figured it." Another pause. "You weren't going to get the horse back." "No," I said. 3 men and 1 of me and you standing there." "No." She was looking at me with something I couldn't quite read. I turned and went back to the barn and hung the rifle back on the nail. She came in after me. She stood in the door of the barn where the light came in behind her and watched me go back to what I'd been doing, which was replacing a rotted plank in the hayloft frame. "Why?" she said. I fitted the new plank into the frame and checked the level of it. "Why what?" "Why did you face them down for a horse that isn't yours? They might have." "I know what they might have," I said. "Hand me the short pry bar, left side 3rd hook." She got it and handed it up. "Why?" she said again. I worked the bar under the old plank that hadn't come fully loose. "Because you're on my land," I said. "And they're not." I heard her breath shift, a small thing barely there. I kept working. The plank came free. She stood there a few more minutes without speaking. Then she went back to the house. I worked in the barn until the light failed. I was not thinking about much. When you have been through a moment like that one, there is a period afterward where the body is still running on whatever it ran on during it, and you need work to let it settle. The plank, the hayloft frame, a few other things I'd been putting off. Good work, simple work. When I came in, she was at the stove. She didn't turn around right away. I washed at the sink and dried my hands, and she put supper on the table, and I saw then that she'd used the good plates. The ones Clara had kept for company, a set of china she'd been given by her mother, blue-rimmed and thin enough to see light through. They had been in the cabinet for 4 years, and I had not touched them. I sat down. I didn't say anything about the plates. She sat across from me and we ate. After a while she said, without looking up, "When I fought them, back on the road, I kept thinking someone would come. That someone would be on that road and would see and would help." I looked at her. "No one came," she said. "For a long time no one came, and then I was in the field and I stopped thinking anyone would." I let that sit. "And then you came," she said. "With your shears." She looked up, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite sorrow, something that lived between them. The least threatening thing a person could carry. "I was going to cut stalks," I said. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." I looked at my plate. I ate, she ate. The good plates caught the lamplight. She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need to. But that night was different from the nights before it, in the way that certain nights are. Nothing changed and nothing was announced, and the shift was real nonetheless. The way weather changes before you can put a name on it. She stayed through the harvest. She stayed after it. I won't dress this up, because it doesn't need dressing. I was a 61-year-old man who had been alone for 4 years, and who had gotten comfortable with the idea that the comfortable with alone was permanent. And she was a young woman with her own damage, and her own way of carrying it, and her own reasons for things that she was not obligated to share with me. What happened between us was not sudden, and it was not simple, and it was not the kind of thing I can put a clean edge on, and say here is where it started and here is where it became something else. It was more like the creek. It runs a certain way because of the shape of the ground, and you can watch it and understand why, and it still surprises you in March when the snowmelt comes. I will tell you 2 things that I remember clearly, in the order they happened. The first is a night in late September, after the harvest was finished and Dell and Virgil had been paid and gone home, and the south section was cut and clean. I was sitting at the kitchen table going through the accounts, the lamp lit, the window dark behind me. Nora was at the other end of the table with the book she'd been working through for 2 weeks, one of Clara's, a novel. I don't remember which one, and she was near the end of it. I could see that from the thinness of the pages in her right hand. She finished it. She closed it and set it down on the table and sat there for a moment looking at the cover. She had the expression a person has at the end of something good, the one that is a kind of gratitude and a kind of grief both at once, the looking at it now that it's over expression. She had good taste, Nora said. In books, I said. She had terrible taste in hats. Nora looked at me. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, abrupt and genuine, the kind that catches a person slightly off guard. I hadn't heard her laugh before. It changed her face completely. "Tell me," she said. So I told her about the hat Clara had bought in Denver in 1968, the one with the wide brim and the feathers, that she'd worn to every community gathering for 3 years, until it literally fell apart, and that everyone in the county had silently agreed never to say a word about. Nora listened with her elbows on the table and her chin on her hands and laughed at the right places and asked the right questions, and we sat there an hour past when we usually went to bed, talking about Clara, who she'd been, what she'd been like, the particular quality of her stubbornness and her tenderness, and the fact that she'd called me a hard-headed old mule every year of our marriage and hadn't once been wrong. I talked about Clara the way I hadn't talked about her since the first year after she died, when the neighbor women would come by and check on me, and I'd have to say something and couldn't always find the words. What I found that night, talking to Nora, was that the words were all there. I just had no one to give them to. She listened without trying to fill the silences, without trying to steer it anywhere, without telling me she knew how I felt. She just let me talk. When I finally ran down, Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said she knew what she had. I looked up. Clara, she said, she knew what she had in you. I didn't say anything. Not every woman does, she said, know what she has. She picked up the book and stood up and said good night and went to bed. I sat there a while longer with the lamp burning, and the accounts unfinished on the table, and the lamp's heat on my face, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. October came cold and clear, the way the best Octobers do in eastern Colorado, days with that high blue sky that looks like it was painted, and nights that dropped fast and hard. I winterized the equipment and banked the storm windows and stacked the last of the firewood, and did all the 100 small things a farm requires before the freeze comes for good. Nora helped with the firewood. She'd asked too, and I'd shown her once how to set a piece on the block and where to aim, and she'd taken it from there with the focus she brought to everything, splitting the smaller rounds clean. The first time she split a stubborn, knotty piece on the third try, she looked at the two halves like she'd won something. I did not say anything. I picked up the pieces and stacked them. We worked 3 full days on the wood, the two of us, and on the afternoon of the third day, we sat on the tailgate of the truck with the stack behind us, both of us sweated through and breathing. The air was cold enough now that the breath came out of you in a cloud, and the light was the thin gold light of October that lasts about 20 minutes before the sun drops behind the range. "How many winters have you done this?" she asked. 37 on this farm, I said. Before that, my father's farm, different ground, same winters. She was looking at the wood stack. She had a way of looking at things she'd worked on, not pride exactly, more like assessment, checking her own work the way a careful person does. "It's enough," she said, meaning the wood. "It's enough," I said. She looked out at the field, the stubble pale and glinting in the last light. "What do you do," she said, "in the middle of it, when you've been inside for a week and the drifts are over the fence?" "Work," I said. "The equipment needs a hard winter's worth of attention, the books. There's always something." "Alone," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a long time to be alone," she said. "You get used to it." She looked at me then, sideways, with an expression I was starting to recognize. The one that said she thought I was wrong about something and was deciding whether to say so. "I don't think you do," she said. "Get used to it. I think you just get through it." I looked at the wood stack. The last of the sun was going off the top of it, the gold draining out of the color and leaving it just gray and brown. "Maybe," I said. She got down off the tailgate and brushed the bark off her jacket. "Not this winter," she said, and went into the house. I sat there a minute longer in the failing light. Nora had found a rhythm to her days by then that I had stopped noticing as separate from my own, which was itself something to notice. She had taken over the kitchen completely, not by force or by argument, but by slow competence. She knew where everything was now, and she had reorganized certain things in ways that made more sense, and which I had adopted without discussion. She had also started keeping her own notes in a small ledger she'd found in the back room, weather patterns, things she'd observed in the field, questions she wanted to ask me about the land's behavior. When I found the ledger by accident and looked at it, which I should not have done, and which I did anyway, I saw that she had been noting things I had not told her. She was learning the land on her own from watching it. I put the ledger back where I'd found it. I did not say anything about it. But on an afternoon when we were working the north fence together, fixing the last of what we hadn't gotten to in August, I said, "The creek floods the low corner in the 3rd week of March, almost every year, 3-week window. The water comes off the mountain and that corner catches it. Don't plant anything there, you want to keep until April." She looked at me. "It's in the ledger," I said. A pause, then, "I shouldn't have left it where you could see it." "My house," I said. "Still." "It's good work," I said. "The notes, you're seeing things right." She looked away at the fence line, said nothing, but the set of her shoulders changed. The second thing I remember clearly is a morning in October, 3 weeks after that September night. It was cold that morning, the first real cold of the season, the kind that comes in off the high ground and means it. I'd been up since 4 and had the stove going in the kitchen and the coffee on, and I'd gone out to check the water line from the well, which was something I did every year at first freeze to make sure the wrapping was still good. When I came back in, Nora was up. She was standing at the stove with her back to me, pouring the coffee, and she'd put on the wool coat that hung by the door mine, which was big enough that it came to her knees, and the sleeves folded over her hands. She turned and handed me a cup, and I noticed that she'd started doing this, handing me things before I asked, the coffee, the pry bar, whatever was needed, with the ease of someone who has learned the rhythms of another person's work and incorporated them. It takes time to learn a person's rhythms. It happens without you always noticing that it's happening. "Pipe's fine," I said, wrapping held. "Good," she said. We drank the coffee at the table. Outside the light was coming up gray and thin, the first real fall light, the kind that lies flat across the stubble field and makes everything look old and clean and finished. She said, looking out the window, "I wrote to my aunt in Grand Junction." I looked at my coffee cup. 3 weeks ago," she said. "I used the post office in Cooperaton. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what she'd say back." "What did she say?" Nora turned the cup in her hands. "She moved, 2 years ago. Someone at the post office had a forwarding address in Salt Lake. They passed it on." I waited. "I wrote again," she said. "To the Salt Lake address. I just got a reply, she's there, she's fine." A pause. She said, "I'm welcome." I looked at the window, at the flat fall light on the stubble. "That's good," I said. The word tasted like nothing when I said it. I said it because it was the right thing to say, the thing a decent person says when someone in their care gets news that means they can go where they were trying to go. I meant it. I also sat there with my coffee cup in my hands and felt the shape of the kitchen change slightly, the way a room changes when the thing that fills it starts to leave. "I haven't decided," she said. I looked at her. I said she's there and she said I'm welcome. I didn't say I'd decided. Her eyes were steady on mine, dark, even in the early gray light. The coat hung off her shoulders. There was a stillness in her that was the particular stillness of someone who has thought something through already and is waiting to see if the other person has caught up. I was slow, I'll admit that. 61 years old and alone for 4 of them and not in the habit of letting myself want things I didn't have. Slow to recognize something when it was in front of me. "Why not?" I said, decided. "Because," she said, "I'm not sure I want to leave." I set my cup down. "There's nothing here," I said, slowly hearing the words as I said them. "Nothing to recommend this life to a woman. It's cold half the year and hard all of it. The nearest town is 40 minutes. There is no." "Harlan," she said, "I'm trying to be honest with you." "I know you are," she said. "Let me be honest back." She leaned forward a little. "I've been in a lot of places. I've had to leave most of them. I've been running toward that aunt in Grand Junction for 2 years and I don't even know her anymore and I don't know what I'm going to find if I go." She paused. "What I do know is what's here." "I'm 61 years old," I said. "I know how old you are." I know how old I am too." I looked at the table. There was a knot in the wood just under my hand, a tight hard knot that Clara had always traced with her finger when she was thinking. I looked at it. "I'm not asking you for anything," Nora said. "I'm telling you I'm not sure I want to go. What you do with that is up to you." I looked up. She was sitting across the table from me in my coat with her coffee cup in her hands and her face plain and open and without the armor that had been on it that first week. It had come off gradually, the way armor does when a person starts to feel safe, and what was underneath was not soft exactly. She was not a soft person, would not be, probably couldn't be, but it was true. She was just herself looking at me. I thought about what she'd said that night in September. She knew what she had in you. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Her hands were cold from the morning and mine were warm from the kitchen, and she turned her hand under mine and held it. We stayed like that for a while in the gray fall light, with the coffee going cold and the stubble field empty and bright outside the window, and the season turning the way seasons do, without waiting for permission. She didn't go. I won't go into all the small shifts and the adjustments and the arguments. We had those too. She was not an easy person to live with, and neither was I, and we were both aware of it, and we made a go of it anyway, which is the only way a go gets made. What I will tell you is how it ended up, or how it is now, which is not the ending but the place where I am standing. She wrote to her aunt in Salt Lake and told her she'd found a place. Her aunt wrote back and said she was glad. The letter was short, 3 sentences. I never read it, but Nora told me what it said. She said her aunt sounded relieved. I thought about what that meant, about what the aunt had known of Nora's life before, and I didn't press. I taught her the farm the way my father taught it to me, without sentiment and without holding anything back. The books, the equipment, the particulars of the land, the habits of the creek, the relationships with the men who bought the corn. She learned it the same way she'd learned everything else on this place, with that sharp and unhurried concentration. Within a year she knew things about the south section that I hadn't known in 30 years of farming it, specific things, drainage patterns, the way the soil changed composition as you moved from the high corner to the low, things I'd noticed and filed away, and she'd taken further. "You're going to run this place better than I did," I told her once. "We're going to run it better than you did," she said. She married me in the spring. We did it at the county seat in Cooperaton, just the 2 of us and the judge and Virgil Ashe, who had driven us in and who stood there with his hat in his hands and his eyes wet, which surprised me because Virgil was not a man I'd have guessed was a crier. "I didn't expect that from Virgil," I said on the drive home. "I did," she said. She was looking out the window. "He told me in the harvest. He said if I left he thought you'd just work yourself into the ground." I thought about that. "He probably wasn't wrong," I said. She looked at me then, and there was something in the look that I will not try to describe exactly because I don't have the words for it, and because it was mine. I'll just say it was the look of a woman who sees a man, not the idea of him, not the useful version of him or the story of him, but the actual man, the whole of him, and who is not disappointed by what she sees. Clara had looked at me that way. I'd spent 4 years not expecting to see that look again. "Then I'm glad I stayed," she said. She took my hand and we drove home in the fall light, the road ahead long and straight, and the fields on either side of it gold and clean in the October sun, and the farm at the end of it waiting like it always waited, quiet and particular and entirely ours. I found the post they'd used eventually, the post they'd driven into my ground to tie her to. I pulled it up that November and split it for firewood. It burned well, hardwood, whoever had cut it. I don't know what the men who left her there thought would happen. Maybe they thought the field would do the work they were too cowardly to do themselves. Maybe they didn't think past the moment of the leaving, which is how most cruelty operates. It doesn't think ahead. It just acts and moves on and doesn't look back. I think about what she must have felt in the night, tied to that post in the dark between the rows. I don't say this to her because she would tell me it doesn't need to be talked about and she'd be right. But I think about it, the helplessness of it, the particular horror of being left. And then I think about what she was 4 years after that morning when I carried her out of the corn. She was standing in the south field at first light with her hands on her hips looking at the sky, the way a farmer looks at the sky, reading it for what it was going to do. And she had my coat on because the mornings were cold. And she turned when she heard me coming, and her face was the face of a woman who is exactly where she decided to be. The shears were in my hand. I'd come out to cut the damaged stalks along the east fence. I found I was still doing that, going to cut the damaged stalks, and still putting it off a few weeks every year, because I could, because there was no reason to hurry anymore, and the field would still be there when I got to it. And now there was someone beside me for the going. The light came up over the east field. She was standing in it. I went out to meet her.